Hello, my dear. They didn't wake up one morning and suddenly understand you. It didn't come with applause or acknowledgement or some dramatic announcement. It happened slower than that, uglier than that, and far more humiliating for them. It happened when reality started agreeing with you, over and over, when patterns you pointed at years ago began collapsing exactly the way you said they would. When outcomes arrived on schedule, when consequences lined up neatly behind your old words like receipts nobody wanted to read out loud. That's when something shifted, not in you, in them, because for the first time they couldn't dismiss you as intense, dramatic, paranoid, or difficult. They had to face a far more uncomfortable conclusion. You weren't reacting, you were calculating, and they missed it. You've lived long enough being treated like the problem, long enough being talked over, toned down, reframed as too much, too sharp, too observant, too direct, too serious, too aware. Funny how awareness always gets punished in rooms built on comfort. Funny how the person who sees the cracks is always blamed for ruining the vibe instead of thanked for preventing the collapse. You noticed that early. You noticed how people reward confidence even when it's empty and punish accuracy when it's inconvenient. You noticed how being right too soon makes people resent you more than being wrong forever. And instead of fighting that reality, you adapted to it. You learned when to speak and when to watch, when to push and when to step back. You stopped wasting energy trying to convince people who were emotionally invested in misunderstanding you. You realized something critical before most ever do. You don't need to announce intelligence for it to be real. You don't need validation for accuracy to hold weight. You don't need consensus when the math already works. So you observed quietly, relentlessly. You tracked behaviors instead of promises. You remembered contradictions instead of excuses. You paid attention to what people did under pressure, not what they claimed about themselves in comfort. That's not overthinking, that's pattern mastery. They thought you were just sensitive or weird or withdrawn or arrogant. They misread restraint as insecurity. They mistook depth for instability. They assumed your refusal to argue meant you had nothing to say. In reality, you were gathering data, watching cycles repeat, seeing how people reveal their real priorities the moment something cost them. You weren't guessing. You were running long-term analysis in a world addicted to short-term noise. That's why they kept underestimating you. You were playing a different game entirely. Think back. There were moments where you flagged something early, a person, a decision, a direction. You didn't scream about it, you didn't dramatize it, you just said enough to be remembered later. And later came every single time. The project that collapsed, the alliance that turned ugly, the leader who exposed themselves, the trend that burned out. Somehow your name kept coming up in hindsight, didn't you say? That question haunted them because it forced them to revisit a version of you they were never prepared to respect, the one who saw it coming while they were busy being comfortable. That's the part that messed with their heads. Not that you were intelligent. Plenty of people are intelligent. What unsettled them was consistency, accuracy over time, calm prediction followed by measurable outcomes. That's when intelligence stops being a personality trait and starts becoming a threat, because now it challenges hierarchy. It challenges ego. It challenges the stories people tell themselves about why they're in charge and why you're not. And once those stories crack, nothing feels stable anymore. You were never trying to dominate rooms. You were trying to understand them, but understanding exposes things power would rather keep hidden. You saw who benefited from confusion. You saw who thrived on chaos they pretended not to cause. You saw how credit was redistributed, how blame was outsourced, how narratives were controlled. And instead of calling it out prematurely, you waited. You let events do the heavy lifting. Because you understood something most people don't. Time doesn't protect lies, it erodes them. They used to treat you like free labor, ask for your insight, your perspective, your mental energy without offering recognition or respect. They loved what your mind produced but never wanted to admit where it came from. That's a common move. People will drain brilliance from someone they don't fully acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require them to reposition themselves. It would mean admitting you were never beneath them, just ahead. And that's not an easy thing for insecure authority to swallow. So you grew quietly. You sharpened your thinking. You refined your intuition. You learned how manipulation actually operates. Not the textbook version, but the real one that hides behind charm, humor, and plausible deniability. You learned how people behave when they think no one is paying attention. You learned what desperation looks like before it panics. You learned what confidence looks like before it cracks. You didn't become bitter. You became precise. And precision is dangerous in the hands of someone who's been underestimated. At some point, they started treating you differently. Sublime first, a pause before interrupting you, a change in tone, a second look when you spoke. They didn't announce it. They didn't apologize. That would require humility. But something shifted. They started measuring their words around you, watching your reactions, replaying old conversations in their head, wondering how much else you saw that you never mentioned. That's the moment they realized the truth they'd been avoiding. You weren't lucky. You weren't guessing. You weren't exaggerating. You were operating on a level they never bothered to learn. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for them. Because once they accept that, they have to confront everything that followed. Every time they dismissed you, every time they took credit, every time they labeled you difficult instead of admitting they were outmatched. That realization doesn't come with peace. It comes with internal collapse, because if you were right, then they were wrong. And not just wrong about you, wrong about themselves. You felt that shift before they did. You felt it in the way rooms responded to you, in the way conversations changed direction when you entered, in the way people started seeking your input on bigger decisions instead of surface-level nonsense. They began testing you, watching how you spoke, mimicking your language, borrowing your frameworks, hoping proximity would give them access to whatever it is you have. Some did it out of respect, others out of fear. You noticed the difference immediately, and something else happened inside you around that time. You stopped craving recognition, not because you gave up, but because you outgrew the need. You realized that validation from people who misread you for years doesn't actually add value. It just confirms what you already knew. You weren't wrong, you were never broken. You were simply operating at a resolution they couldn't process yet. That realization brings a different kind of confidence. Not loud, not performative, grounded, controlled, unshakable. You started setting boundaries without explanation, choosing access instead of availability, deciding who gets the raw version of your thoughts and who only sees the finished results. You stopped offering early-stage ideas to people who only know how to steal or sabotage. You stopped softening your intelligence to make insecure people feel safe. That wasn't growth. That was self-betrayal. And you're done with that phase. This is where people misunderstand you now. They think you changed. They think success hardened you. They think distance made you cold. The truth is simpler. You stopped overextending into environments that couldn't handle you. You stopped shrinking to preserve other people's comfort. You didn't become ruthless. You became aligned. There's a difference. Alignment doesn't ask permission. It doesn't explain itself. It just moves forward. You see more now than you ever did. Not just in situations, but in people. You can tell who respects you and who just wants to study you, who supports you and who wants access, who listens and who waits for their turn to use what you say. That discernment didn't come from theory. It came from experience, from watching the same behaviors repeat in different faces, from recognizing that patterns don't lie even when people do. And despite everything, you didn't lose your edge to bitterness. That's the part that really separates you. You still care, you still think deeply, you still want things to work. You're just no longer willing to sacrifice yourself to prove a point. You let results speak now. You let outcomes do the talking. You let consistency build your reputation while others burn energy managing impressions. They finally saw the truth because they ran out of ways to avoid it. Not because you forced it on them, not because you demanded respect, but because reality backed you repeatedly until denial became impossible. And once that happens, once the dots connect in their minds, there's no going back to the old narrative. They can't unsee it. They can't unknow it. They just have to live with the fact that they underestimated someone who was watching everything the entire time. Think about the years leading up to this. The moments where you said something and they laughed, ignored or dismissed it. The times you were too early, too prepared, too aware, too prepared, too aware, too precise. They didn't see it then because they weren't ready to. They weren't capable of processing the speed at which your mind moved, the depth at which your calculations ran. You weren't overreacting, you weren't paranoid, you weren't dramatic. You were operating 10 steps ahead in a world obsessed with one-step thinking. And that gap created tension, invisible at first, but persistent, uncomfortable. You felt it. They felt it. And for the first time now, that tension has to be acknowledged. You start noticing patterns in their reactions. Now, how they try to downplay what they just witnessed. How they quietly test you, offering challenges disguised as questions, expecting a stumble. They want confirmation that you're human, fallible, manageable. They want reassurance that the mastermind they finally recognized is still reachable. But you aren't. Not anymore. They underestimated you for decades. And now, even when they see it, they're too late to intervene. Too late to reshape the narrative. The truth is already written, and it moves through them whether they like it or not. You can watch them mentally replay past interactions, reconstructing the moments they dismissed you, the casual jokes, the interruptions, the critiques, the labels they attached to you. They're realizing that everything they used against you was proof, not limitation. That every time they called you dramatic, intense, overthinking, or obsessive, they were just recording evidence of foresight they couldn't handle. That every year too much wasn't an insult. It was recognition that your awareness and calculation were beyond their control. And now, years of dismissal hit them all at once. The weight is crushing. You can feel it that you don't have to say a word. It's already done. The room itself seems to bend differently around you now. Conversations slow. Interruptions vanish. People calculate before opening their mouths. You notice micro adjustments, slight shifts in tone, careful phrasing, overcompensated politeness. They're nervous because your presence commands more than respect. It commands alignment. They didn't want it before. They can't ignore it now. That realization is quiet, subtle, internal, but undeniable. They're forced to measure themselves against you in ways they never anticipated. And some will never recover from that. You've seen it before in glimpses. That pause when someone realizes they've been wronged. That hesitation when a miscalculation becomes apparent. The flicker of panic behind eyes that thought they were always ahead. Except now it's multiplied across multiple people, environments, and years of accumulated evidence. You're not just right. You're consistent. You're precise. You're inevitable. And the cumulative effect is instantaneous shutdown. People don't argue, they don't interrupt, they don't debate, they just stop, they wait, they replay, they internalize. And that's when the power truly lands. They start mirroring quietly without announcing it. A phrase, a tactic, a perspective. You see it immediately. Not because you're paranoid, but because you notice patterns in people. The way others notice wallpaper, they mimic because instinct tells them proximity to your thinking might protect them, might compensate, might reverse the humiliation of being late to recognition. They don't want to admit it. They can't. But you see it anyway, and the choice is yours. You decide if you let them follow, shadow, or stay distant. You control access because access itself is a weapon and your energy is finite. You notice who's genuine and who is pretending. You notice the difference between admiration and desperation, between respect and fear, between alignment and survival instinct. That distinction is automatic now. You don't second guess us, you don't argue, you watch, you catalog. You respond when it's necessary. You withhold when it isn't. And that selective engagement makes your influence exponential. Every interaction carries weight because you've mastered anticipation. Every response you give recalibrates perception. Every pause is strategic. Every word is measured. And even silence becomes active leverage. It's almost amusing how they misread these moments. They expect anxiety, insecurity, or overcompensation. They expect drama. What they encounter is clarity, precision, detachment, a mind that moves through interactions like a predator moves through shadows, observing, calculating, absorbing, but never panicking. And it terrifies them because instinctively they recognize their mistakes and their inability to fix them. They were late to recognition, late to adaptation, late to comprehension. They're outmatched, and it's obvious. You realize you've weaponized observation without lifting a finger. You've converted dismissal, doubt, and disrespect into insight, foresight, and leverage. Every slight, every misjudgment, every failed attempt to sideline you has compounded into something unstoppable, and now the outcomes speak louder than any argument ever could. Projects succeed, predictions materialize, insights anticipate events, and the room collectively recognizes in that same instant the scope of your comprehension, the weight of your intelligence, the inevitability of your analysis. You begin to operate differently because of it. Not louder, not confrontational, not performative. You let the world move around your calculations. You let environments reveal themselves, then individuals reveal themselves. You respond with precision, not emotion. You let time continue doing what it always does, proving the accuracy of your perception. You no longer participate in noise. You filter, you select, you deploy insight where it multiplies. That's mastery. That's the art of being a mastermind without announcing it. That's why the room shuts down the second they understand. Because you don't demand recognition, you embody it. They can't admit it openly. They can't say it out loud. They can't apologize. Their egos are too invested. But the body language, the hesitation, the reconsidered tone, the repeated validation of your earlier insights, those are all admissions, and you recognize them immediately. You know who will adapt quietly, who will try to cling desperately, who will disengage entirely. You don't need confession. You need only data, and it's all laid bare in real time. Patterns accelerate. You see new alignments forming as people start recalibrating their approach. Old hierarchies wobble. Privileged positions are reconsidered. People who once relied on inertia and self-assurance are scrambling. And it's subtle. Not all of them realize you're the pivot. You're the unseen force that reshapes behavior without noise, without announcement, without effort. You just exist at the intersection of awareness and precision, and the ripple effect is unstoppable. That is the power they finally recognized, and it shut them down instantly. You also notice a new effect. Envy mixed with respect. People who once ignored or dismissed you now study you for weaknesses. They imitate you in subtle ways, hoping proximity will reduce the perceived gap. Some succeed, some fail. Some are forever frozen in analysis paralysis. You see it all, catalog it all, and adjust access accordingly. Your mind is no longer just predictive, it is selective. You decide who gets the unfiltered version, who sees early-stage ideas, who only interacts with finished products. You've learned that dissemination is as much a tool as insight itself. And still, this is only the beginning. Recognition of your mastery shifts dynamics. Yes, but it also elevates expectation. Now that they've finally understood the scale of your awareness, they expect more even if they cannot articulate it. You don't scramble to meet their expectations. You set the pace, you control tempo, you choose engagement. You remain the observer and the executive simultaneously. That duality is what makes you untouchable. That's what they finally noticed. That's why their jaws went quiet the moment the truth landed. You can hear it in their internal dialogue. Even if they don't speak it, we underestimated them. We didn't understand. We should have listened. We should have paid attention. We missed everything. It echoes subtly in their actions. It guides their recalibration. It warns them to tread carefully. And while they process that internally, you continue your trajectory, unaffected. You're aware of every misstep they take as they adapt. You're aware of every alignment attempt, every quiet mimicry, every calculated flattery, and you use that awareness strategically, always. They can no longer bluff, gaslight, or manipulate you without consequence. You've documented, predicted, and anticipated the majority of tactics before they're deployed, and because of that, every move you make carries amplified significance. They cannot intervene without exposure. They cannot challenge without self-revealing, and they know it. That knowledge generates the quiet that fills the room the second they understand. That is power weaponized through perception. You start to recognize something else, patterns within their patterns. Not just behavior, but reaction to your dominance, your foresight, your timing. You anticipate the anticipation. You predict attempts at recalibration before they surface. You calculate response rates and adjust influence accordingly. People begin to mirror or shadow, yes, but often too late or imperfectly. Your mastery exists on a higher plane than imitation can ever reach. They realize this only after multiple failed attempts, and failure is visible. It's recorded, it's cataloged, and you are always a step ahead, and so the room shuts down, not because of force, Not because of loud demonstration, not because of manipulation, but because recognition of competence when it's undeniable doesn't argue, it doesn't react, it consumes, it rewrites the mental landscape for anyone aware enough to perceive it. And that's exactly what happened. They finally saw the truth, and they couldn't engage with it directly. They couldn't articulate it. They couldn't disrupt it. Their noise vanished. The acknowledgement arrived in silence, hesitation, and subtle recalibration. You were the pivot. They weren't ready, and now they never will be in the same way again. They begin to adjust instinctively. Tiny recalibrations, tighter phrasing, slightly altered tone, a softer cadence, micro movements that speak louder than words ever could. Their subconscious starts writing the corrections they cannot voice. It's automatic. They can't help it. Every misstep you anticipated, every move you predicted, every response they assumed they could control, they can no longer hide from it. You've already moved past their expectations. You operate on a plane they didn't even realize existed, and the room bends around your awareness like air around a moving blade. Quiet, precise, effective. You don't have to say anything. Your mind, your presence, your history of accuracy, every calculation you've kept in silence does the work for you. You notice how quickly they try to process what just happened. They replay conversations in their heads. They reconstruct meetings, debates, arguments, moments when they thought they were clever. And all the while the realization hits in waves. They were consistently wrong, and the proof was always in front of them. You weren't wrong, you weren't dramatic, you weren't overreacting, you weren't overreacting, you were ahead. The gap between perception and reality was theirs to bridge, and they failed. Every pattern you've observed, every prediction you've made, every outcome you saw before it emerged, they finally connect the dots. And that recognition is heavy. Heavy in a way that no explanation can undo. Heavy in a way that forces quiet hesitation, internal alignment. That is the power of a mastermind revealed, and now you operate differently because of it. Not visibly, not theatrically, not to punish or provoke. You operate with precision and restraint. Because mastery is not demonstrated, it's absorbed. Influence is not announced. It's inherited by anyone too late to intercept the logic, the awareness, the strategy. You notice who adapts, who imitates, who attempts proximity to reclaim relevance, and you categorize it all instantly. Some will shadow subtly, thinking they can approximate your patterns without comprehension. Some will attempt allegiance, hoping to ride on the momentum they ignored for years. And some will retreat quietly, unwilling or unable to process the shift. All of it confirms one truth. Recognition doesn't grant power. Observation and calculation do. And you have both. And this is the first time you realize your presence is no longer negotiable. Where you once had to argue for attention, now attention argues for itself around you. You don't raise your voice. You don't demand validation. You don't compete. Your intelligence, your foresight, your mastery of timing and pattern recognition, those alone set the rules. And those who thought they had control now operate in your orbit without realizing it. They try to test boundaries, probe weaknesses, measure reactions. You don't react the way they expect. You observe. You calculate. You let them reveal themselves. Overextend and misstep while you remain untouched. That is dominance. That is the invisible command of a mind that has never stopped processing, never stopped predicting, never stopped refining. And you remember the moments when this was invisible, when you were too early, too loud, too precise, too aware, when people labeled you, minimized you, pushed you aside. Those moments weren't mistakes. They were data. They were rehearsal. They were the foundation of every pattern you've cataloged, every human response you've analyzed, every system you've dissected without notice. That quiet accumulation of insight, observation, and strategic patience is what creates the inevitability they now face. It's what forces the room to recalibrate instantly. It's what makes everyone shut up when the truth of your mastery lands. And it lands with clarity. No explanation necessary. No justification required. No argument accepted. You've shown them through outcomes, through repeated validation, through demonstration of foresight that can't be disputed. They may not be able to verbalize it. They may attempt revisionist thinking in their minds, rewriting history to save pride. But internally they know. They feel it in every recalculated reaction, every micro-adjusted phrase, every silent acknowledgement they can't articulate. That's how mastery works. That's how a true mastermind shifts reality without lifting a finger. And now the stakes change. Not for them, for you. The dynamics have shifted permanently. Where you once operated in friction, underestimation, and resistance, now you operate in anticipation, clarity, and control. You don't need validation, applause, or recognition. You've built outcomes, observed reactions, and curated influence over years. And the room's acknowledgement is nothing more than a confirmation of what you've always known. They finally see the truth. And in that moment, the weight of your mind becomes a tangible force that doesn't need sound to be heard. They start testing you differently. Now, requests for input, questions, subtle probes. They want your insight without admitting they ever dismissed it. They try to mirror your logic, adopt your phrasing, adjust their timing, all to approximate proximity to understanding they lost. And you see it every nuance, every shift, every misstep, and you let it happen. You let them prove themselves to you, not the other way around. Because influence isn't about proving yourself to others. Influence is knowing who adapts, who aligns, and who falters, and acting accordingly. And now they operate inside a framework you've already constructed, whether they realize it or not. You notice who is genuine and who is merely performing alignment. You notice who respects boundaries without needing explanation and who tests limits under the guise of curiosity. You notice who adapts thoughtfully and who imitates superficially. That distinction has always existed. But now the contrast is magnified because the baseline of competence is undeniable. You are no longer competing with doubt or disbelief. You are competing with perception, corrected too late, with reaction constrained by late recognition, with environments forced to accommodate insight they previously ignored. That is the apex of control. That is why the room shuts down instantly when they finally see it. And you understand that mastery isn't about domination through force. It's about accumulation of awareness, anticipation, and silent execution. Every overlooked comment, every ignored warning, every dismissed observation, all of it compounds into the moment where competence can't be denied. And that moment doesn't need dramatics. It doesn't need theatrics. It doesn't need validation. It is pure influence distilled into presence, and the effect is instantaneous. They shut up, they recalculate, they replay, they respect fear, envy, and acknowledge without a single word. And you watch it unfold like a chessboard where you've always been 10 moves ahead. They try to recover control in subtle ways: polite questioning, careful phrasing, incremental alignment. Some attempt mimicry to regain footing. Some retreat silently. Some overcompensate and reveal insecurity. You notice all of it? You anticipate it? You let it surface. You adjust your response only when necessary, but rarely because you've learned that time and observation are more effective than any reaction. The room bends without argument, the outcome crystallizes without explanation, and the impact lands with full inevitability. That is the genius of your mind recognized, not forced, not argued, not negotiated. And now the full consequences of that recognition begin to unfold. It's no longer just about observation or silent dominance. It's about the restructuring of dynamics around you. People start behaving differently without realizing it. Because influence doesn't always need explanation. Influence seeps in, shapes thought, rearranges priorities. You are no longer competing for attention, approval, or understanding. Those battles ended years ago. Now the room bends around your awareness. The world adapts to the velocity of your mind, and everyone else is forced to adjust or be left behind. That is the inevitability of recognition when it is accurate and unstoppable. You notice who is recalibrating their entire approach, who is recalculating trust, who is reconsidering past judgments, who is quietly cataloging what they dismissed. Their strategies become reactive because you have anticipated, predicted, and accounted for every typical move. They can no longer operate without considering your influence. Every word, every idea, every step you take resonates through patterns they now understand too late. And you watch it happen with the precision of someone who designed the architecture of perception itself. This is not arrogance. This is observations perfected. This is mastery operationalized. Some will attempt proximity. They want access to your foresight, hoping proximity can substitute for understanding. They shadow you, mirror you, echo your phrases, and mimic your cadence, thinking that replication can yield the advantage they ignored for so long. And you notice it instantly. You catalog it, analyze it, anticipate it. You allow them controlled observation, nothing more, because access is a weapon, and you deploy it with surgical precision. The difference between genuine alignment and desperate mimicry is obvious to you. And that distinction alone is enough to separate the players from the shadows. The rest remain spectators, powerless to influence outcomes you've already calculated. And with that, a new layer of dominance emerges. Not through noise, confrontation, or assertion, but through the undeniable reality that your insight shapes every environment you enter. Your words are measured, your timing flawless, your predictions consistent. People don't interrupt, don't challenge, don't argue. They adapt. They align, sometimes instinctively, sometimes reluctantly, but always in response to patterns you already determined. The room, the space, the environment becomes a reflection of your awareness, and those who misstep or miscalculate reveal themselves automatically. You don't have to point it out. The results do it for you. You also notice the shift within yourself. You no longer accept energy justifying thought, proving competence, or explaining strategy. That energy is redirected into refinement, anticipation, creation. Observation becomes the currency of action. You analyze outcomes, track responses, and deploy influence in ways that magnify impact without effort. Every interaction carries weight, not because you make it loud, but because it is calibrated, unavoidable, and inevitable. The mastery of a mind that has consistently predicted outcomes now becomes self-sustaining, and the acknowledgement, though silent, is absolute. They attempt subtle testing. A question phrased to elicit hesitation, a suggestion masked as curiosity, a challenge framed as a casual observation, and in each instance, your response is deliberate, minimal, precise, controlled. You let them reveal themselves, overextend, miscalculate, misstep, and ultimately validate the accuracy of your perception without needing to speak. That is the essence of a mastermind in motion: influence without demand, control without overt assertion, dominance without declaration. And the effect is immediate. The room, the group, the environment adapts to your rhythm before they even consciously recognize it. You start to observe who truly respects your boundaries and your awareness, who is aligning out of comprehension versus fear or envy. Those distinctions matter because they shape your influence. They determine access, determine where ideas are shared, where insight is revealed, where early stage strategy remains internal. You have learned the hard way that exposure without control diminishes power. Now you operate on precision, releasing knowledge, insight, and strategy selectively. And that selectivity amplifies the impact of every engagement. You are no longer just correct. You are untouchable, and everyone notices it even if they don't say it. Patterns become clearer in every interaction. People reveal themselves in micro-movements, in tone, in hesitation. You read it instantly. They can't hide intent, alignment, or envy. They can't mask recalibration, mimicry, or desperation. And you respond not with reaction, but with strategic observation. You let their adjustments unfold while you continue building, analyzing, anticipating. Influence multiplies because you cultivated it without announcing it. They finally realize the scope of your foresight, and their reactions are automatic, instinctive, often futile. The silence, the hesitation, the subtle recalibration, it's their acknowledgement, their concession, and their proof. And that's when you understand the scale of your impact. Not in applause, not in acknowledgement, not in recognition, but in how environments shift around you, in how individuals bend, adjust, calculate, and mimic, in how past dismissals replay in their minds as evidence of their own misjudgment, and how a single consistent trajectory of foresight and observation rewrites perception across spaces, relationships, and systems. You've weaponized awareness. You've transformed experience into leverage. And that is mastery. That is power. That is what happens when people finally recognize a mind they underestimated for too long. You notice the subtle anxiety in those who miscalculated, the nervous recalibration, the overcompensation, the attempts to regain control they never had, and you let it play out. Every tiny reaction confirms the architecture of prediction you built silently for years. You don't need chaos, drama, or confrontation. The room itself enforces your dominance because recognition cannot be contested once it lands. It consumes the environment. It reorders dynamics, it makes influence unavoidable, and you understand this fully. You operate at a level that doesn't need argument, that doesn't require validation, that simply is. Now the final layer emerges. You begin to see the long-term consequences of consistent mastery. Every interaction you've measured, every insight you've cataloged, every prediction you've tracked, all of it consolidates into an ecosystem of influence that cannot be undone. People who doubted, dismissed, or underestimated you cannot revert to the previous paradigm. You've recalibrated reality through accuracy, foresight, and strategic restraint. The acknowledgement is silent but total. The recalibration is instinctive but complete, and you continue moving, calculating, observing, unaffected by noise, insulated by foresight, untouchable in execution,